welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC, Rach.
And I'm your co-MC, Rich. Tonight, we're joined by our returning guest, Christopher Gray. Hey, Chris, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is great. This is the first time I have been on with both of you here at the same time.
It's true.
We used to do interviews one-on-one, and we've since expanded.
That's great.
Exactly. For those who've listened to Plus One Forward for a while, in 2017, we had the Happiest Apocalypse on Earth episode, and then Great American Novel happened in 2019. It's 2021, the end of the year, so we had to squeeze you in. We'll talk to you again in 2023. But for now, what Pbta game has impacted you the most since the last recording? Beyond your own games, of course.
Yeah, I could just list mine and then be done with it. But let's see. I think if I had to choose, actually, and it's an oldie but a good one, and that is Masks.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm going to put Masks on this list is because I played it when it came out, however many decades ago. And I don't think I played it right. And I really studied it last time for a campaign with my home group, and I really leaned into the rules as intended. And it was a much better experience. And so I quickly catapulted to be one of my favorite games again. I also would like to give a shout out to Jason Mills's game, which is not quite out yet, but it has been circulated in certain circles, which is Demigods. The Kickstarter's been done and he's late, but it's coming. It reminds me of Masks in a lot of ways, except there's a whole lot of really great machinery in there that now that the systems have been updated over the years.
Cool. Very cool. All right, well, let's jump on over here and read a sitch. Read a sitch.
In Read a Sitch, our guests will discuss some aspect of Powered by the Apocalypse tabletop play that they want to draw a little bit more attention to. Chris, what topic did you want to talk about on the show?
I waffled a bit on this, but actually I think, especially since we're going to be doing Great American Witch today, I thought we should talk about failure. The reason that came up in my thinking was because when Witch came out, there was a huge discussion around Pbta by a prominent member in the gaming industry using Witch as an example of why the Pbta game system is geared towards failure and why that's not fun. I was a little surprised that Great American Witch was used as a model for this because it isn't really a milestone game in the system, I don't think. But what I wanted to talk about was the idea that I think when you look at Pbta in that light, you might get disappointed because it's more of a traditional way of looking at it. It's assuming there's a victory condition. In other games, when your dice don't work, you're on your way out of the game. Either the experience stops or maybe you don't get to play anymore because your character's dead, and it's just frustrating, and that sort of losing on the dice means you're losing the game. But in Pbta, you play out the failures just as much as you play out the successes. So it's just two different tracks on the same story. And so I don't get why you would be upset about a failed roll when there's no victory condition. I think there's a misconception. What Pbta does is sort of just drive the fiction forward no matter what. It never stops. So you're either playing something that went the way your character wanted, or you're playing something that wasn't what your character wanted, but something different has happened. And Great American Witch specifically says that the characters don't die unless you choose to. So there's no risk in failing. In fact, it makes the story more interesting, and that's sort of the point. Because new characters grow, and they're heroes, and they have challenges.
And there are also a number of Pbta systems where there's an explicit mechanical reward for failure, which is the XP on a miss. I assume that's not present in Great American Witch.
The Bennies, I guess, if you will, are more character-driven.
Okay.
And
cool.
So your character expands, but it's because they accomplish something in their magic. And so then they can adopt more magic. And it's really very focused on a particular corner of the game.
But the XP on a miss, of course, present in games like Monster of the Week, Dungeon World, the more heroic cinematic stuff. So yes, you could miss often, or you will early until you raise those stats. But it's part of the development cycle. Now, that's only a small part of the overall Pbta landscape, but it's the first thing that I think of is, hey, you can design the system to account for failure and reward it as well. What do you think, Rach?
I have, oddly enough, seen I don't know if it's exactly an inverse, but kind of an inverse of this discussion happening. also disparaging on Powered by the Apocalypse. That idea being, well, if failure doesn't have any game-ending cost to it, therefore there is no reasons for players to succeed. So Powered by the Apocalypse becomes a game of failing forward and it doesn't matter. Have either of you bumped into this discussion?
Well, I think there's a misconception around what failure means. If failure is a victory condition as a player, then you might feel bad about rolling low all the time. That means then that you are only playing a game about a failing character. Mm-hmm. But if the failure mechanic is really just about conceding narrative control based on what's going on, which is how it's handled in Witch, but if your rolls are missing, that means that the outcome that you expected didn't happen. The story is going to continue to move forward, and so the narrative consequences are what are important, not the attrition or numerical consequences.
Right, and also, a miss, if it's always you fail, that's a really boring conversation. Pbta games explicitly give a menu of moves for the MC, GM, what have you, to react to those failures. And it's a great way to mix tempo, to bring in new threats, to tilt the scene. It's exciting stuff. It's not a task resolution system where a fail state just means that task didn't happen. It should really cause a change in the overall situation.
Some of the newer systems are doing a good job of giving players agency on outcomes, which I think Great American Witch does, and some of my newer systems are really leaning into that, because I think there's one icky feeling of bad rolls and you're just not getting the narrative out that you're trying to get out, and that can get frustrating. And so I like systems in Pbta that will concede narrative control for certain circumstances. Like in Great American Witch, you can actually pay a charm in order to introduce a truth about the situation. So if you're just failing ridiculously, you can just say, you know what, I want this to be true. And okay, it's true. And we can move on. And you can kind of get rid of that ickiness because you have shared control. Also, if you roll well enough in Great American Witch, if you roll a 10 plus, then you have narrative control over the outcome. So it does give some agency back to the players. And that's an important consideration, I think, as we're continuing to innovate this design.
Agency of players, that's one of the reasons why I don't love the, for lack of a better term, act under fire move, which is 6- is a miss, 7 to 9. The GM says how you kind of succeeded, but also have to pay a cost. 10 plus, you did it. That takes away a lot of authority for the player and really puts all the work back on the MC's shoulders, or GM, what have you. That's a particular move that I don't love. I understand it's a good catch-all for a design that doesn't want to have to create a bajillion moves, but I don't love it for that specific reason.
With all this talk about Great American Witch, Chris, I think it's time to open our brains.
That's awesome.
Open your brain. In Open Your Brain, our guest will discuss an Apocalypse Engine game, and we've already talked a little bit about it. Tell us some more. What is Great American Witch? What's the setting? What's it about, Chris?
Well, the Great American Witch is about the secret world of witches in the modern world. And it's also about the supernatural threats that are trying to destroy them. In a lot of ways, I like to look at this as an alternative to World of Darkness, where we're focusing on witches instead of vampires. And instead of self-destruction, we're working on trying to build the world to be a better place. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
But Chris, can my witch wear a badass trench coat?
Yes. And have a katana.
Oh my gosh.
You can do it in this game.
You've won. You've won Dark World game design.
Well, we have to have it. And it's our favorite genre. I mean, let's admit it. The witches in this game, though, are extremely powerful. When people get introduced to the game the first time, they're very surprised about how OP these witches are. They can level cities if they want to. And that was designed on purpose and sort of as a response to what happens in games like Vampire, where you get uber powerful, but there's really no constraints around that. And so you can just become the superheroes, I guess. In which it's all narratively constructed, so there's consequences in the narrative for using your power. That was something that I really wanted to play with. Also wanted to get the idea of the witch out of being the underdog of history, that they're really behind a lot of society right now, and they're trying to change the world for the better. So they use their power in that way.
Since we're early on talking about the setting, why Great American Witch? What's wrong with Canada?
There's nothing wrong with Canada. Canada's quite nice. I hear.
There's a lot wrong with Canada.
Never been. I've never been to Canada. I can't write from a Canadian experience, but I can write from an American one. Also, it neatly fit in with the Great American Novel framework from which it was built. So I guess there was a sort of branding decision. But I did decide to use America as sort of the centerpiece because there are a lot of themes that I'm very familiar with that I could bring out in earnest. And I would like to see this setting expanded into other locations and other cultures, but I would need people from those cultures to do it because the game really gets embedded into it. And I just feel like I would be disingenuous if, say, even if it was like the Great British Witch or whatever. I'm just not. And I think we have enough of those. So I would like to, one day partner with some other creators from other cultures to flesh out the setting in other parts of the world.
Great Canadian Witch, Rage, come on.
The Great British Witch Bake Off is all I could think of.
I love it. That could be a supplement.
This is the baking expansion. Chris, how are the mechanics in Great American Witch different from the mechanics in Apocalypse World?
Well, I would say that there are major deviations. When the game was released, I really didn't talk about it with the Pbta language because I think that if you're used to a Pbta game, you would be surprised about this game. It is definitely on the Pbta chassis. The similarities are easier to bring out than the differences. But the similarities are that it has the spectrum of success on a 2d6 roll, that it has that fiction-forward approach. It is packaged in playbooks, but it does deviate significantly from that point. The moves are way more general. So the different playbooks don't have different moves. There's a set of moves for everybody, and they're extremely general. And that's by design because they are meant to apply to almost any narrative situation you can think of. These aren't like fighting or dodging kinds of moves. These are, what is your intent kind of moves.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this came from Great American Novel, and that was the design there, which is what I might be attacking somebody, but am I attacking somebody to protect somebody else, or am I attacking somebody out of anger? And that will determine your attribute. So that is one major deviation. And also there is a layer of, you would call them moves in the Pbta framework, but they don't really work like that. They're more narrative prompts that you can use to better describe your power as a witch. And the prompts themselves vary based upon whether your witch is aligned to the mother, maiden, or crone aspect. And that's really a nebulous sort of personality that you take on where you're in a scene, you say, you know what, I'm feeling like I'm in a crone state right now. Therefore, these powers are going to be more powerful for me than these other in different states.
And that changes scene by scene?
Mm-hmm. It changes scene by scene. You can also spend currency to change it mid-scene if you need to.
Is this a thing you declare at the beginning of the scene?
Right, yeah, and that's the other difference is that the game is very structured in terms of scenes. You play out scenes in chapters. And so different chapters have different mechanical effects. If it's a chapter where you are, let's say you're on a mission and you are really awesome at what you're doing, you might get an advantage on the kind of moves that you're going to do in that mission. But if there's a menace that's coming and attacking you in your hearth, then you might be at a disadvantage. And those chapter conditions, when they're set, you say, okay, I'm going to be in crone here. My character's in crone, and you choose to be in that. And then the game plays out with your character in that state.
Definitely seeing the parallels to Great American Novel as you talk about the structure of the game.
Yeah, it definitely is a Great American Novel game. In fact, I set it out to be a Great American Novel game, but then I realized I needed to break it to be the witch game that I wanted. And the big reason was because in Great American Novel, you're playing out literary experiences. So the biggest problem you're going to have is that maybe somebody's breaking up with you. Whereas in Great American Witch, you're actually dealing with threats that could potentially kill you. And so I had to increase tension in the narrative. And to do that, I needed to build in different mechanisms that are different than Great American Novel.
Chris, you mentioned earlier that in Great American Witch, the player characters are doing mind-boggling, huge tasks. And matters of life and death that would be simple statistics don't really matter because the player characters die when their players decide, this is the narratively correct moment to die. How is that reflected in the mechanics? Is it less granular or more broad?
Well, character harm is not about whether the character is physically harmed. And so this idea of the narrative outcomes are going to be way more important than the physical outcomes in the game. So what that means is that we're way more interested in motivation than we are in what actually happens in the fiction. And that gets resolved in the narrative. And I'm talking in the abstract here, but I mean, you end up with moments like there is going to be a big confrontation, let's say, with a huge batch of werewolves that are cause some problem in, say, I don't know, Mom's Diner. In a more traditional game, or even in other Pbta games, you're going to be playing out the action, the moment-to-moment actions that happens in that confrontation. But in which what you're doing is you're playing out the moments in between the action. Where, when you think about like an MCU movie where there's a whole bunch of action happening, but the real peaks of the story happen with the characters making a decision in the middle of that action that impacts another character. And so those are the moments you're playing in Great American Witch. So there's going to be a whole lot of werewolf fighting, but what we're really interested in is, if I use this magical spell, what's that going to do to the diner? And how is that going to impact the neighborhood that I'm trying to protect? And how will I be viewed by my friends and allies? And those are the kinds of questions you end up asking, because that's what ends up costing.
So the questions are scope related, much broader, and that's how they're able to do big things, as well as that you've widened that focus.
And when you decide to bring a fae into this, because you can through your magic, there are some major consequences to doing that. You're now introducing a fae into the story. This actually happened in one of my campaigns. It was not supposed to be about fae, but because a fae was introduced in the story as a product of using a move, the story ended up becoming about the fae. And so you can actually change the direction of the entire campaign just by doing a particular magic move because of the consequences of that move. So players become very discerning about the actions that they make in the game as a result.
All right, Chris, what is your favorite move in Great American Witch, and why?
Well, the moves, strictly speaking, are things like protect and rally, and they're not all that interesting. They're designed for facilitating the fiction. So I'm going to look at the magic, which sort of work like moves. Mm-hmm. The magic is what's really interesting in the game. And if I had to choose a favorite, I'm going to probably break the rules and do two.
We'll allow it.
We'll allow it? Okay, cool.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's look at the Craft of Lilith. Instead of playbooks, you have crafts, and this is sort of the magic that you practice, and it's done in a tradition that you adopt. In this case, Lilith can be extremely effective, shall we say, at causing problems. And so my favorite one there's a divination where you can reveal to a subject what they must do to conquer all of their challenges and inspire them to make a lasting positive change. So this is one of those narrative triggers I was telling you about. So if you do this, say somebody's yelling at you, you can just do this spell and suddenly they're going to rethink their whole direction in life. And then that's going to create a whole course of events that you may or may not have anything to do with later on, but that's happened, and that moment has changed for that person.
Oh no, it's the moment of dramatically yelling at someone and telling them to consider their life choices.
Right. And then they're like, okay, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't be in this coffee shop yelling at this person. Maybe I need to join the Navy and actually do something, with my life and do what my mother told me I should do all this time. And but then there's a juxtaposition. That's the mother aspect of Lilith. If you're in Crone, one of the powers is that the subject will bleed out of all body orifices until they painfully die. A narrative trigger. And yes, OP, but you look at that and you play it judiciously, shall we say.
Just trying to think of something terrible to say in reaction to that.
Nope, I got nothing. That's some big stuff.
It's a good example of OP, and how the powers can really explode the fiction.
Do all of the crafts have like a big showstopper OP power like that?
It's usually in the Crone aspect, but yes, there are crafts that can call in a natural disaster, which have been used in multiple times in games that I've played. There's all kinds. That everybody has sort of the subtle ones, and everybody has sort of the explosive ones.
Well, I'm really interested and curious what explosive powers Rich and I are going to take hold of in this episode. So why don't we go over to our next segment and act under fire?
It is time to act under fire.
In Act Under Fire, our guest will run Rich and I a short segment of Powered by the Apocalypse game. Okay, Chris. What are we doing for Great American Witch?
Well, first you are going to choose your craft. And then we are going to go into in media res of a heated situation. Normally, you would choose a coven first because the coven really defines the type of game that we're going to play, but we're just going to swing with it.
I think since you talked about Lilith, it got me pretty interested, so I'd like to go with a Craft of Lilith.
Right. Lilith is often considered the blood magic witch, but they are really about trying to keep a much older practice alive and invert some of the lies that have been spread through the centuries about Lilith. They're a little tenacious. They also can make vampires.
Cool.
I am going to follow slightly fangirly impulses and go with the Craft of Pbta.
Yeah, Pbta is one that comes from the classics, but this craft is really about communing with the spirits, in particular, the spirits of the deceased. There's another craft that's more interested in the natural spirits, but this is the triple goddess at the crossroads before you move on and is really in command of the veil itself. So this is a very exciting craft. So now I need to decide what a Lilith and a Pbta are doing together. We can say, for the sake of brevity, that the two of you are in a coven that is interested in protecting a neighborhood from supernatural threats. And this is an older neighborhood. Let's say it's in New York. Oh, you know what? Let's go all in. Let's say this is New Orleans.
Nice.
And so this is a really old neighborhood. This is the French Quarter.
I was about to ask.
So that's where you are. That's your neighborhood. This is what you've been trying to protect. And your coven is probably pretty large. But there have been rumors that a particular nightclub on Frenchman is just overflowing with vampires. Now, vampires are not a new thing down here. You've had to mitigate them and maybe, I don't know, created some of them for different reasons. But this isn't good because they are colonizing in a way. They've taken over this club. And it looks like it might be a menace or a threat to the rest of the neighborhood. Usually vampires go as lone hunters, so it's weird that they're building a colony like this. So your coven basically, or on your own free will, decided to go and check this out. It is 2 a.m. The EDM is pouring out of this club. For some reason, they're not playing jazz like the better one across the street. And, there's a line out the door, maybe 50 people waiting to get into this club. It's the hot spot. It's Friday night. Everybody's having a great time. What do you do? What's your plan on getting into this club?
So thinking back to when we discussed the game, you said the aspect we would enter a scene with would become important. Do we declare that now or once we figure out what we're intending to do about the situation?
Yeah, that's right. You should tell me your aspect before we get started. And I should have introduced a chapter, but we're just cutting corners. We're going to call this a mission chapter, which means that you're going to be acting and looking your best. This is that moment when the camera starts really low and then pans up and you see these amazing, awesome, in their prime, looking cool in a tableau before they move into the scene. So I'm going to need to hear what that looks like.
So I'm going to go with Chantal being the name of my character, also a name of an old Monster Hearts character from very long ago. Chantal knows that she is going to go potentially rock this club. She is wearing clothing that would be a little bit louder. There is a witchy edge. Imagine like a shawl that's black and sequined and catches the light from all of the flickering gas lamps in the French Quarter. It's very breezy, very witchy, very clear that she is either into the goth scene, because I think there's a few mortals who are sort of into that supernatural gothy scene in the French Quarter, but also fashionable in the supernatural sense. Not a trench coat.
No, of course not. We wouldn't presume. That's awesome. And so what aspect are you in? Mother, Maiden, Crone. Maiden is you're feeling young, excited, energetic. Mother, you're more protective. Crone, you maybe are not in the nicest state of mind right now. You've had enough and you're just sort of doctor's orders taking care of business.
If we're crashing a nightclub, my heart says Maiden. I mean, what business would a Mother or a Crone have? They might have business messing up some vampires, but getting into the club, Maiden's the right aspect.
We just pay the cover. That's how we get in.
Oh.
The experienced one.
I think for my witch, the Lilith craft, I'll just go with the bog standard name of Plussy for her. And I believe she is in the crone aspect. When she enters the club beside the gothed up Chantel, Plussy is wearing a much more conservative dress, a broomstick skirt. She has long sleeves and puffy shoulders. It's almost dowdy in a way, but it is odd because the dress seems to drink in the light rather than shine like all the leather and PVC and vegan leather that people are wearing throughout the club. So she looks very out of style but intimidating in her crone aspect.
So I'm seeing in this tableau that you are just entering the club. Is that the plan?
Yes, we begin at the beginning.
The game works in which I lay out conflicts that you have to confront. You can't make a move unless you're confronting a conflict. And that is to drive the story forward. If there's something that you want to do and there's no conflict in play, then you can pay to have one made. But it's escalated. Right now, the conflict is, are the vampires going to let you in the club? That's the question we have to answer. So when you arrive and you have the tableau, the EDM's pounding, your very presence probably parts the line as they're all looking at you and you walk in. But then there is this sort of insipid-looking young man wearing a white suit and a white fedora. And he has this know everything more than you smile. And he gives you sort of the half hand up gesture in which is supposed to be a stop sign. But he doesn't respect you enough to really fully put the hand up. It's sort of a limp. And doesn't even look at you in the eyes. It's just a dismissive wave. This is your obstacle getting in the club. What do you do?
Plussy will glance over at Chantel's. She's all full of vim and vigor this evening.
Chantel is going to watch this hand as this bouncer type figure dismisses them and says, so you're not even going to acknowledge me with some words, asking me to leave the premises? My money spends, friend.
What's your intention on this? This is when we start wondering which stat to use. So are you just trying to navigate him and letting you in by saying I'm a paying customer, or are you trying to condemn him for not doing his job properly? That's the difference between wisdom and severity.
See, if I was a smart witch, I would be using wisdom that I have a 0 in, but I think she's being severe. Mm-hmm. I think she's condemning him for his dismissive behavior.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I meant to say enforce your will. Condemn is more about rallying other people against somebody. Enforce your will.
There's a whole lineup that can come rally to my cause.
What is this nonsense? Come, get this insipid little brat out of the way. All right, so this will be our first roll. You'll be rolling severity against a conflict. How are you going to get in? Just so you know, when the game is played at a table, conflicts are written down on an index card, and there can be many in play that you decide to confront or not. But in this case, we just have the one.
And we're rolling 2d6?
Rolling 2d6 plus severity.
So that is a 5.
Okay.
I am not very severe.
Well, just to let you know how the rules work, you need to get better than a 5.
I did not get better than a 5.
Essentially what this means is the situation is going to escalate. So White Fedora, let's call him White Fedora, just looks at you, just disapproving. Clicks his tongue. Well, that's too bad. I was going to let you in, but now the only way through is through my friend Buffy. And that's when a vampire steps forward. Now, Chantel does not know that this is a vampire. However, Plussy does, because Liliths know vampires just by being Lilith.
Mm-hmm.
This is a 6'8" bulging man who once wore a dress shirt but has busted through it. And he is now walking forward because there's a situation. He gets to finally do his job that night. He hasn't bothered to hide his fangs. He stands up, squares up with you all. Did you want to play?
Buffy, is it? If you want to exist tomorrow, you will step out of our way tonight.
You're trying to scare him, huh?
Yes, I am.
All right. You are also going to roll Enforce Your Will, which is a severity roll.
It is, and I happen to have chosen the array of a +2 in severity, and I am in Crone, so I am rolling with a +3. Very severe.
Yeah, thanks for noticing the modifier. When you are in an aspect, it does add or subtract depending on your aspect.
Very cool. I rolled a nat 10 to 5, so that is 13.
Awesome. Okay, well, that means that you would, first of all, would get a charm, which is currency that you can spend to add a truth to the fiction. And you can do it for other things too, although we're probably not going to get to it today. Then you also get narrative control. Now, you have narrative control over anything except any conflicts that are in play, but you've just resolved this conflict. So you have narrative control. You tell me what happens.
This bulging dress shirt wearing man recognizes that Plessy is a Lilith, or there's something instinctual within his condition that recognizes that threat, and he lowers his eyes and he steps out of the way. Chantel and Plessy can walk right past White Fedora as well, and enter the club.
And White Fedora, is he standing agape or is he incensed? What's his reaction?
I think he's scared, and he goes to tell important people what's happened.
This is why I like to award narrative control, because, you made the situation harder. I had nothing to do with this. I'm just facilitating. And I'm just reporting what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So White Fedora's run off into the back. EDM's happening, so nobody notices you unless you want to be noticed. And just looking around, Plessy can tell there's got to be at least 24 vampires in here. And this is a full-on army. And it's only a matter of time before they notice you. And part of that is going to be accelerated by White Fedora.
Chantel, there are over 24 of them. And since no one seems to be interested in vampire football, I think that they are a real and present threat to the neighborhood. Perhaps we pull the fire alarm and I destroy all of them while people escape?
Chantel folds her arms and says, "Have you considered reaching out to the spirits that must also be in this building and rallying them as allies? New Orleans is haunted as all heck, right?"
I did consider it. That's why I brought you with me.
I don't think the spirits are going to be too happy with this type of undead lingering around. I wonder how one can scry and reach out to a spirit or a ghost that is haunting this building, that has had many lives before it was repurposed into a bar and then repurposed into a vampire bar.
No, there is a mother spell that allows you, it's a divination that allows you to commune with spirits. We're in New Orleans, so there's a good chance there are spirits here. However, because we're playing the rules out, I would like to introduce an idea. Everybody starts with one charm. Right now, Plessy has 2. But you can spend your charm to make it true that there is a spirit here. And if you do that, you have control over who that spirit is, what they want, and everything about that spirit. Or we'll let the dice determine, and we can kind of just play it that way.
I do liking the dice determine, but let's spend a charm.
Okay.
To say there is, in fact, a spirit that lingers in this building. As to what kind of spirit, I wonder if it's the spirit of a nun, a Spanish nun that came over during the point in time when the Spanish controlled New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. And why does she linger? I should add that in the fiction of the game, there is a veil, and usually people pass over, but those that don't have a reason.
I think there is a need to protect this home, that this home belonged to a friend who lived beyond her lifetime. So she was a guardian spirit of sorts, and her friend had spent all of their money and resources crafting this beautiful home, and she vowed to protect it, and that is why she continues to linger here now.
All right, so you're going to roll your mother spell, which is a divination, and that's a wisdom roll.
So I am in maiden form. What would it cost me to switch over?
Well, you just spent your charm, so...
Yeah, yes, I did.
Yeah. I could have given you all of information. You could have made a more informed decision, but that is what happened. So your wisdom is +0?
My wisdom is +0, yes. So that's a 6.
Okay. Wow. So you have connected with this spirit, Spanish nun, who is locked in some sort of vicious loop. And she is angry and wrathful and just moving from point to point like she's teleporting from point to point inside of this room. It's like the music is driving her nuts. And so she cannot commune with you because of this dance club that is just beating and beating and beating and beating. And it's just causing her to loop. So we've created this other situation. If you want this ally, you're going to have to do something about the music. However, the magic that you did, can you describe what it looks like when you do that divination? What were you using? Were you using a crystal? Were you just using your mind?
I think she's reaching out and touching the floorboards because ghosts walk on the same surfaces humans walk on.
Mm-hmm.
She can reach down and touch the floorboards and feel those echoes and the footprints of beings that others can't see. And that's how she reaches out and connects to them.
Okay, so here's how it gets worse. You see this looping happening, and when you're touching the floorboards, and that sort of creates a connection with the veil. So she immediately drives over to you and manifests. So now we have this wrathful apparition in front of you that fills the dance floor, and everything screeches to a halt. Everybody is looking at you and this ghost.
Well, that was impressive.
It didn't really do anything, though. She's angry. She's very angry.
People are screaming and running, except for the vampires.
It appears I may have accidentally sorted out the mortals from the vampires.
Works as well as a fire alarm. I'd like to go ahead and curse the closest vampire to me.
Okay. What's the curse?
The Crone's curse. The subject will bleed out of all body orifices until they painfully die.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have to do that at least once in a Great American Witch game.
I do, and they're vampires, so I don't even have to feel bad about it.
Right. And the conflict is obvious. There are vampires. There's also another conflict in play, which is angry, wrathful spirit.
Mm-hmm.
But you're going after the vampire. So go ahead and you have your Crone bonus, because you're in Crone.
Mm-hmm. My Cronus.
Your Cronus.
Little portmanteau there.
Plus he's Cronus.
Oh, no.
And I rolled a 9 plus 3 makes that a 12.
Okay. Oh, look at that.
We are polar opposites tonight, Rage.
Well, my dice historically do not work.
It's true.
They cannot dice.
Well, you're illustrating our point earlier, in which failure is also fun.
It is.
We wouldn't have had a vengeful spirit in the middle of the dance floor, New Orleans, on Frenchman.
This dance floor needed a vengeful spirit.
A vengeful nun spirit.
It is New Orleans. Every dance floor needs a vengeful spirit. How are you going to market?
And have it. Anyway, we were dealing with the fact that you rolled really well. So that means you've resolved this conflict. You get another charm. You have 3 right now. And you also have narrative control. What happens to this vampire? You can go as detailed as you like or as your listeners will allow.
I think that our listeners will ask me to be gentle here.
Sure.
But the curse does say the subject will bleed out of all body orifices until they painfully die. So I imagine that it will be one of those on fast forward type things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And just because we have introduced White Fedora, I want him to witness this as he was bringing back some of the head vampires. And they realize who they are messing with at this point, that Buffy has been cowed and White Fedora has brought the bosses to watch one of the others that they had sent ahead as that one melts. I'm kind of imagining like Indiana Jones spoilers for a decades old movie, but something along those lines there.
Yeah, and the right, and since it's a vampire, it's more like it's more than just your average bleeding out of every orifice.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of other special effects involved.
Indeed.
The bosses have come out. They are all dressed for the event, but now the full lights are on and they're posturing against you. And this wrathful nun has now turned its ire onto the bosses. And so you are now in a situation where you're going to let things continue as they are, or are you going to help the bosses who are certainly going to be destroyed by this nun?
Ooh, good cliffhanger.
Yeah, I like that cliffhanger. Gosh, which way would we go?
It's all about consequences, narrative consequences. If you let this vengeful nun out, then you have a whole nother problem.
Wow, Christopher Gray, that was a really fun and intense and OP taste of Great American Witch. Thank you so much for running that for us.
That's great. I don't really want to stop. This is exactly what I love about this game.
Chris, if our listeners are looking to find Great American Witch or follow more of your work online, where can they find you?
The best place is Christopher.world. I have all of the Christophers in one place. We've been plotting for a while.
You can make a lot of MCU movies now.
I could. I need to collect
Crisis
those.
on Infinite Crisis.
I need to collect those licensing fees, by the way. That's where most of my stuff is. Great American Witch you can find on DriveThruRPG. It's published by Gallant Knight Games. They do most of my games, actually. And you'll find my other current project, Highcaster, is coming out soon, which you'll find in the same locations. And yeah, maybe that's what I'll be talking with you about in 2022.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Plus One Forward, Christopher. It was a joy.
Thank you.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD, Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our Pbta game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.